thanks for inviting me and the great introduction. Um, this gathering is really about the third space, but space is absolutely meaningless without people, right? People build space, people create meaning out of space. It's our relationships with space that makes places like this really important. So that's why I think it's a bit important to also talk about nomad society and how this all relates to it. And as Sebastian mentioned, this is all being fed into a book. It's a book that is actually a follow-up to Invisible Learning. We're taking some of the key concepts we had and translating it into English for part of the book, but the rest of it we're looking at how this all ties into education, how it ties into how we work in nomad society, and also how we live in nomad society as well, and the emerging futures of it, and how we connect all these pieces together. So not surprisingly, the book is going to be called Knowmad Society, and it's not quite ready yet. It'll be ready at probably by the end of this summer, but I do have some notes I can share, right? Don't have the book, but I got some notes, and unfortunately, my handwriting's really messy. So I'm going to take you through my notes on this and give you a preview for the work that we have. Now, this volume connects learning, working, living together in nomad society. And we brought together an international team of people, people from the Netherlands, Chile, United States, Germany, Australia, together. So we got Tube Esselink, who runs the Learning Lab in the Netherlands, Edwin Debray, who is a business change consultant. Cristobal Cobo is the co-author of my previous book. He's at the University of Oxford. Arthur Harkin's a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota. Eddie Heron in Australia. He's a younger person finding his own nomadic way. Gary Hart, who's a former United States Senator and presidential candidate. Christel Hartkamp, who's an organizer of a Sudbury school down the street. Ronald Vandenhoff, who we met a couple hours ago. Marcel Kampman is an outstanding designer and also an educational redesigner in Meppel, elsewhere in the Netherlands. Franziska Kruger from Germany. She's a recent graduate from the Knowmad's Business School in Amsterdam. Brock Lemieux is also one, but he's now living in Norway. Got me from the United States. Peter Spinder, who is an organizer of the Knowmad's Business School in Amsterdam, and Bianca Stockman, who is an advisor to organizations that wish to innovate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that each of us has been contributing into this project and to really give you a summary and an introduction into this. Oh, we got the ugly chart. This is the only chart that I'm gonna share with you, because research shows that the instant I share a chart with you like this, about a fifth of you will fall asleep. But this really highlights the changes that we have to deal with as we construct third spaces, as we develop nomad society, as we lead in these areas. So we've talked about many of these things already. The 1.0 paradigm really being the industrial paradigm. 2.0 is, in my view, largely what we have today. It's largely tied into the emergence of the knowledge society. And 3.0 is really driven by accelerating technological change, globalization, and the emergence of nomad society. In other words, people are being asked, so what can you do with your knowledge? How do you contextualize it? How do you apply it in new contextual ways? And so you combine these things together. But the interesting impact of this is also accelerating change. Right? Accelerating technological change is feeding into accelerating social change. And this is leading to what many of us term the technological singularity, which is the point where technology changes so fast it almost seems simultaneous. The impact for us as humans is that we're hitting the limits of our imaginations. We're having a hard time imagining what's going to happen next, right? So we look at the impacts of these and the demands, these changes and the new demands that they have on people. We're moving from fundamental relationships that used to be very simple and easy to be defined to ones that are really complex and creative. And I like to use the word teleological for this because it means that the system itself generates its own goals. This top-down goal generation or goal dictation systems doesn't work. It requires flatter organizations. So we're seeing hierarchies dissolve, that as people are meeting in third spaces and organizing by themselves or intentional ways. We're looking for synergies rather than mechanical relationships. Our worldviews used to be determined for us. It used to be that if your grandfather was a baker, your father was a baker, you were expected to become a baker, and your children probably become bakers too, and your last name had probably been Baker, right? Or Holland, I suppose, Bakker, right? It happens. The Smiths, where do you think that came from? Causality used to be very linear and easy to tell what caused what. When you turn on the news, it was very easy to tell what was happening. Now things are changing so fast that it seems anti-causal. B causes A, which causes N, which also causes A. We just can't make sense of it because change is happening so fast. Change processes used to be also similarly slow and assembly-oriented. This is how industrial society works. It is assembly-level change. But now organizations are engaging in creative destruction and asking for creative destruction within them. Our realities used to be objective. Now it's more contextual. What is your reality? What is our reality? We reinvent it. And the place is, of course, much more globalized than we are local, and that's one of the main points of this gathering today, is that we are really going global with this conversation. But the changing nature of work also requires new workers. So Society 3.0 is really, for people, it's nomad society. So I think we talked about before, the general consensus is about 40 to 45% of the workforce within the United States and Western Europe by 2020 would be nomads or zézépayers, self-employed people, some call it, or free agents. Nomads, as I define them, are nomadic knowledge and innovation workers that are creative, they're imaginative, and innovative people that can work with almost anybody, anytime, and anywhere. And the reality that is really pushing this is that corporations are no longer loyal to individuals for any given period of time, right? People are losing their jobs, they're told, hey, we're putting a line in the sand. But at the same time, people are also moving on their own paths. They're moving off to create their own futures, entrepreneurial pathways, or collaborative things, or they're willing to take the dive and not really know what they're gonna land into. So this is all changing. People are focusing on their work more and not on jobs. We move from job to job to job, but the work is something that stays with you, that we develop with ourselves. So in the emerging economy, everybody's at risk of career derailment or reinvention, and especially nomads. So they must continuously design or redesign their jobs and the nature of work itself. So nomads are not age restricted. Anybody could be a nomad. Now, one of the interesting thing is that when I come to Seats to Meet, or in Minneapolis, in a place called Coco, that most of the nomads are on the younger end of the spectrum. That's the largest group. The second largest group is on the opposite end of the spectrum. People have already retired. But the middle area is yet to be defined. We can talk about that more later as we go on. We only have half an hour on that, on theories why this happens. Nomads leverage their personal knowledge to produce new ideas and new applications within context. So they apply their ideas and expertise contextually. They're highly motivated to collaborate. They purposefully use new technologies. That is, we don't use technologies just because we have to use technologies or feel that we have to use it, but rather we develop technologies based on our needs and our purposes, where we find applications. This implies that we can be very creative in how we use these things. They're open to sharing what they know. They develop habits of mind and practice to learn continuously. This also means that we can unlearn what we learned before and relearn new stuff, and creating a habit of lifelong learning. They thrive in non-hierarchical networks and organizations, and they're not afraid of failure, because failure can be learning opportunities. And that's how nomads see them. So in the great places that I think that we see nomads are in coffee shops. On the top we have a coffee shop in Houston. On the bottom we got a coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York. They're just natural co-working and collaboration spaces. Free Wi-Fi is always a plus, right? So what happens if a banker is sitting next to a ballerina, sitting next to an architect? What kind of conversations will they get into? What kind of new products might they create, right? But now we're creating spaces that intentionally bring these conversations together. So the serendipity is pre-enabled. Is anybody from Starbucks participating? I hope they're listening. This is their future. Yeah. But in the Netherlands, this is where we find nomads. So we've got Seats to Meet, and in Amsterdam, there's now a Nomads business school that's really working on the challenge of creating new workers for nomad society. So in the first part of the book, we talk about learning in nomad society, and we really recap much of what we talked about in the Invisible Learning, project. What we see is that there's a mismatch between formal education and challenges that are imposed by innovation society. That schools are less relevant to teach skills that people need for jobs to be relevant today. We need to shift from focusing on what to learn to refocusing on how to learn. Another thing that we uncovered is that we tend to use new technologies to teach the same old shit, or do the same old stuff that we've done before, rather than to do new things that we need to be doing to succeed in the new economy. And we also have changing conceptualizations of space and time and our relationships with this in our environments. And we need to develop soft skills. And then we also discuss democratic education. We focus on experiences from the Sudbury schools, the Nomads Business School. And the Nomads Business School talks about schooling democratically as a program that provides an alternative to mainstream education. And they do some really fascinating work. You could read more at nomads.nl if you're not already familiar with it. And also in the book that's coming out, we all have a full chapter devoted to that. Now, invisible learning is something, invisible learning recognizes that learning is something that's natural to humans. We just don't recognize it. So we put learning on a spectrum where formal, non-formal, informal to serendipitous. And invisible learning really fills that space between non-formal and serendipitous and all the fuzzy meta spaces in between. So what happens, for example, when you learn a culture that's beyond your own? That learning is very much invisible, or a different language. Now, the interesting thing is that maybe only 10% of what we actually learn comes from formal schooling. Everything else tends to be is invisible. We define soft skills as being incredibly important. Some examples of those are sense-making, social intelligence, novel and adaptive thinking, cross-cultural competencies, transdisciplinarity, that is thinking beyond your one discipline, and there are many more. Leadership is something that we do not really focus on teaching that is critical for success in Society 3.0. Crystal Hartkamp wrote on democratic schools, and especially the Sudbury schools. These are schools that let kids create their own educations. And she argues that democratic schools enable kids to be vibrant, energetic, entrepreneurial, and most importantly, to follow their own passions, rather than to follow somebody else's passion. And the interesting thing is that when we start to think about these things, in the world's greatest democracies, the last place that we see democracy practiced is in schools. So they work to bring it in, to bring equality and mutual respect among everybody and watch this emerge. Oh dear, we've got another chart here, and I promised I was not going to talk about another chart. So we've got the guy who actually created this chart, Tu best a link. Tu, can you explain this to me?
I hate the way you do this.
How do I turn this on?
Is it on? I think it's on. It's not on?
It's not on?
It's not on. Thank you. Okay, thanks, John. Right, okay. Reinventing teaching. So in the same way that Ronald is not your boss, in the learning lab we experimented with other ways of, what teaching might be like. And what I think what Ronald does is create a free space where things come together. Right? Literally, actually, school means coming together, right? Samenscholen in Nederland. So that's kind of the same thing that we try to do. It's like more of a choreographer. I found out because a friend of mine, a theater maker, Falk Richter, he makes theater pieces in a very similar way as I make learning art. Because as soon as you start to see the classroom as a place where you come purposefully together to create something that means something not just to you but also to the world outside of the classroom, and it's not just a place where you get knowledge transferred from somebody or something into you, or where you get reflection either from yourself on yourself or somebody else on yourself or from the teacher or your peers to you. Or even further, we have problem-based learning, which is about experiment, where you try to solve a problem which you didn't choose. If, on the other hand, you come together to create something that means something to you, it is a subjective knowledge with an intention that is directed outwards. There's a little graph, subjective, objective. Are you a consumer? Are you a creator? And if you're in the creative, subjective part, there you get on a quest, which is really personal. But if you go to come together in a school, then you find out what is your collective quest and what is my personal quest. Well, to find that out, you need some kind of guidance or some kind of an ecology around that can help you to find each other or create something that is bigger than you. So the same way as a director of theater or a choreographer creates the conditions for meaningful movement, how you get together. And that's what this part is about. Sorry.
Brilliant, thank you.
Was that okay?
That's brilliant, yes. And to everybody on Twitter, I did promise earlier this evening that there would be a surprise speaker. So to the organizers here, thank you for putting up with that. I thought I had some fun. Another way I like to have fun is with shocking photos. But another point that we have in the book is that we have to stop producing packaged brains in our schools. We have to enable people to follow their own passions. We have to create really individual brains that are not packaged, that are unique to each of us. And that the other reality is quite simple, that 1.0 schools cannot teach 3.0 kids. So we have an opportunity to co-create here. When we talk about working in Knowmad society, we've got Ron Vandenhoff, Edwin Debray, and Bianca Stockman. They're contributing some excellent pieces on this. Because Knowmads are willing to co-work with you, they're really not your employee. As Ronald says, they're helping to form new socioeconomic entities. And that networks such as Facebook and LinkedIn are only starting points for its value creation, but we have to start thinking bigger. We have to start talking about the purpose of applications of these technologies, the creation of new technologies, of how we can use these in real socially mobilized workspaces as well. And then Bianca and Edwin help us think about de-hierarchying hierarchical organizations. Try saying that 10 times fast. What is the demand that Knowmad society puts on existing organizations? What are some of the practical dilemmas? And they provide some survival tips, and they provide some case studies from Semco, Finext, and WDM, which you can read in the book. This is the end of business as usual. That organizations are flattening, that we're sharing new knowledge is turning into new value creation. All right? The short-term run for money, quick money, doesn't make sense anymore. Rather, we have to start looking at how do we create long-term value before we get longer-term returns from. And these are powered by people, they're powered by social software, and also energy and drive to make this happen. And this is why places like Seats to Meet are very important, or in Minneapolis, Cocoa, Minneapolis, that they're a critical part of Society 3.0 in this flattened space. They mediate the conversations. Edwin and Bianca wrote an excellent piece on de-hierarchy and hierarchical organizations again. Flat network organizations are values driven, all right? They're also organized as value networks. They are organized into smaller cells. By that I mean that they're small, agile, they're able to expand in complexity and respond more rapidly to challenges and opportunities as they emerge. The passion and talent is what supports the structure. That enables self-determination, also through autonomy. It allows organizations to tap into intrinsic motivations. They share leadership. That power is not something that's imposed. Rather, leadership is something that could be shared by everybody. And any necessary expressions of hierarchy could occur naturally at functional or even temporary levels. That they also embrace transparency, that information is shared rapidly, and that transparency enables adaptive entrepreneurship at all levels. They focus on cyclical processes. Again, going for the longer term value creation rather than the short term money run. And they're much more democratized. And de-hierarchying naturally leads to greater democratization, more competence and responsibility, trump rules, and power hoarding. Now, in living in Knowmad society, we looked in some things. I mean, one of the key points is that Knowmads need to create their own paths. They have to make their own choices. So we brought in Arthur Harkins, colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota, and also three younger nomads that are looking at creating their own way, finding their own way. And that nomads need and their nomadic identities are becoming increasingly ambiguous as we interact in multiple virtual, physical, and social environments. This makes it harder for us to ask the question, who am I? If we constantly have to reinvent ourselves. We constantly have to reinvent our pathways. And so they're exploring how to create personal groundedness in a world where the sort of linear, deterministic approaches are really no longer valid. Arthur Harkins talks about how we manage chaos and uncertainty in nomad society. And he talks about that when we have choices, or in nomad society, we're constantly asked to make choices, which in turn lead to more choices. And this leads to a sort of perceived choice-induced chaos, because nobody's making the choices for you. And nobody's telling us what are the pathways that we have to do. And moreover, with accelerating change, the world is looking much more chaotic and ambiguous than we could ever imagine. So Arthur is tying into some literature from D. Hock and others, and advocating that we need to create a chaotic balance between chaos and order to manage our own lives. And this really kind of ties into like Taoism. They're walking that fine line between chaos and order. So this can lead to constant problem reframing and replatforming, otherwise known as context applications, and they can help us develop purposive pathways along our borders between this chaos and order as we search for answers to the who am I in nomad society. So what now? And this is really how we close out the book. Brought in Marcel Kampmann, who is in Meppel. He is working on redesigning communities. There's a project that's taught an S school system on reinventing schools in a community. He's sharing some of that. He's also starting up a project called Happy Campers. And from his description, he says, happy campers are people who change things simply by touching them. These people can shift paradigms, change thinking, create both movement and movements, inspire others, make things happen, and realize seemingly impossible projects. In other words, he's creating another layer for nomad society, another value-driven network. It's going to be very interesting to learn more about that. Gary Hart closes off the book and afterward with his thoughts on what it's going to take from our national leaders. And it's at this point that we really leave readers and I suppose people in this room also with questions on what we need to invest in as societies to ensure each nation's success. Like what do we do with healthcare, transportation, citizenship? Does nomadism obviate citizenship? Or what are the new responsibilities for citizens? Do we create something new? And again, this is the book in process. So the notepad is still filling up. And so we have a little writing to do. But bit by bit, the pieces are coming together. And I think we're creating something really beautiful out of it. So the book is going to be released in a Creative Commons license. So we invite you to steal it when it comes out. We invite you to remix it. We invite you to share it with others. Put in your own 2 cents, make something out of it, and feed it back to us. And it's coming this summer, and you can read it in the future at nomadsociety.com or get a preview of it now also at nomadsociety.com. Thank you.